A lot of infrastructure stories sound small right up until they change how people build. S3 gets a file system interface. A fake plugin turns into a foothold. A security incident comes back for a second round and gets worse. An old Kubernetes path starts running out of runway. And the next generation of workloads is already pushing the platform to act differently. That's the story this week, not just new features, more like the layers around the system are becoming the system. Hey, I'm Brian Teller. I work in DevOps and SRE, and I run Teller's Tech. This is Ship It Weekly, where I filter the noise and focus on what actually changes how we run infrastructure and own reliability. Show notes and links are on shipitweekly.fm. If the show's been useful, follow it wherever you listen. Ratings help way more than they should. And if you want more signal between episodes, check out oncallbrief.com. We have 5 main stories today, then the lightning round, and we'll wrap with the human closer. We're starting with Amazon S3 files because AWS just changed the way that S3 can show up in applications. And I think people are going to oversimplify that story really fast. Then we've got the malicious npm packages pretending to be Strapi plugins, which is just a very 2026 supply chain story. After that, Trivy again, but this time as the uglier follow-on. We talked about the earlier incident before, and now the sequel is broader and hits the CI path even harder. Then we'll hit Kubernetes Ingress2Gateway 1.0, and the bigger reality that teams are going to have to migrate towards Gateway API without pretending that this is a one-click swap. And finally, Kubernetes Agent Sandbox, because the platform is already starting to admit that agent-style workloads are different. Story 1. Amazon S3 files is interesting, but I would not call it S3 is EFS now. Let's start there. AWS launched S3 files this week, and the headline version is simple. You can expose an S3 bucket as a file system and mount it from EC2, ECS, EKS, or Lambda. AWS says it supports NFS version 4.1 operations, syncs changes back to S3, and uses a high-performance active data layer to make file access fast. What I think is interesting here is how this compares to the old S3FS or generic Fuse style pattern, because people have been trying to make S3 feel like a file system forever. But that old approach usually came with the usual caveats: weird semantics, performance trade-offs, caching weirdness, consistency questions. General, yes, it mounts, but should it? Energy. This feels smarter than that. Not because it magically turns object storage into a perfect shared file system, but because AWS is very clearly building and managing the translation layer for you instead of leaving you to duct tape it together yourself. So this is related to the old S3FS and Fuse idea in the sense that it solves the same human problem, which is my app or tool wants files, not bucket APIs. But it is not just a nicer wrapper around the same old hack. It is AWS putting a managed service boundary around the pattern. That said, I still would not read this as S3 is basically EFS now. I think the better read is that AWS put a managed file system layer in front of S3 so file-based tools and workloads can interact with bucket data more naturally, especially AI and ML style workflows, without everybody inventing their own copy pipeline or mount trick. Where I still have questions is real world behavior once this is under pressure, multi-writer contention, sync behavior, what the latency story looks like once the happy path cache assumptions stop being happy. So for me, the takeaway is not S3 replaced file storage. It is more like the object store just got a much friendlier interface for workloads that were never really written to think in buckets. And that matters because once the interface changes, people start building differently. Story 2. The fake Strapi plugin story is ugly, but very believable. Next up, the supply chain mess. researchers found 36 malicious npm packages disguised as Strapi plugins. They followed the Strapi plugin naming pattern, used post-install scripts, and came with different payloads aimed at Redis and PostgreSQL, credential harvesting, reverse shells, and persistence. That is the part that I think lands. Not just NPM had malware again, more like this is what the modern trust problem looks like. The package ecosystem, the install workflow, the environment variables, the local services, the containers, the database paths. All of that is fair game once developers or pipelines run something they should not have trusted. And I think the Strapi angle is useful too, because it plays on something real. Developers expect there to be plugins. They expect those plugins to be named in ways that feel obvious. Attackers know that. So the trick is not brilliance. It is just getting close enough to expected behavior that nobody slows down. That's why these stories matter. Not because every team uses Strapi, because every team uses something with a plugin model, a package manager, and a little too much trust in what shows up during install. Story 3. Trivy is back, and this one is the uglier sequel. Next up, the Trivy follow-up. We talked about the earlier Trivy incident back in episode 24. This is not just the same story repeated. This is the second chapter, and Aqua's own write-up says that pretty clearly. On March 19th, Aqua said a threat actor used compromised credentials to publish malicious releases of Trivy, Trivy Action, and Setup Trivy, and that this was a follow-up from the March 1st incident because the original containment was incomplete. That matters, because now we are not just talking about repo disruption or suspicious activity around the project. Now we are talking about official releases and CI tooling being turned into a distribution path for credential theft. Aqua said affected users should treat reachable secrets as compromised and rotate them. Multiple security write-ups also called out that the compromise actions and releases were used to target CI/CD environments directly. This is the nightmare version of security shifted left. The scanner is not outside the blast radius. The security tool is not outside the blast radius. The thing scanning your code may need the same level of paranoia as the thing deploying it. And I think that is why this one is worth covering, even though we already talked about Trivy before. The first story was something is wrong. The follow on story is the earlier compromise turned into malicious releases and broader CI impact because the attacker still had a path back in. That is new enough and ugly enough to justify a follow up. Story 4. Kubernetes Ingress2Gateway is the kind of migration story platform teams actually live through. Now let's get back to platform work. Kubernetes announced Ingress2Gateway 1.0, and the framing is pretty direct. With Ingress Nginx retired as of March 2026, the question is not really whether teams will move towards Gateway API, but how they do it safely. That is why I like this story, because it is honest. A lot of migration stories get told like they are basically just YAML translation and maybe a few find and replaces. But anybody who has lived through one of these knows the hard part is not converting manifests. The hard part is discovering all of the weird behavior your current setup has been carrying for years and deciding what actually needs to survive the move. And Gateway API is a real shift. More modular, more expressive, better separation of concerns. Great. But the migration still has to happen in environments where teams have old annotations, old controller-specific assumptions, and production traffic that does not care how elegant the destination architecture looks on a blog post. So I think this is one of those very real platform stories where the value is not the destination alone. It is having a safer path off the thing everybody relied on for years. Story 5. Agent Sandbox is Kubernetes admitting the workload model is changing. Last main story. Kubernetes also published a piece on Agent Sandbox, And I think it is worth paying attention to, not because everybody needs it tomorrow, but because it signals where the platform sees things going. The argument is basically that long running AI agents do not behave like normal short lived stateless workloads. They need stable identity, workspace persistence, isolation, scale to zero behavior, and warm poles so they do not feel painfully cold every time they wake up. That feels right to me. Because even if you are not all in on agent hype, the platform problem is real. Once you have workloads that hold context longer, need tool access, spin up and down differently, and may need tighter isolation than a normal web app, the old abstractions start feeling a little off. And that is part of why I like this story paired with S3 Files. S3 Files says, here's a friendlier interface for data because these newer workflows want file semantics. Agent Sandbox says, here's a friendlier runtime shape because these newer workloads want different lifecycle semantics. Those are different stories, but they rhyme. The platform is getting nudged by new usage patterns, whether we want to call that AI, agents, or just another round of abstraction pressure. A few quick ones before we wrap. Fortinet customers have an actively exploited problem on their hands. Fortinet released an emergency update for Fortinet EMS after CVE 2026 35616. A critical flaw was exploited in the wild, and CISA added it to the known exploited vulnerabilities list on April 6th. Karpathy had one of those posts making the rounds again that taps into the bigger conversation around how much software work is shifting from direct coding towards orchestration, review, and steering. I do not think the useful takeaway there is blind hype. I think it is that a lot of engineers are already feeling the interface to software work changing, even if the results are still uneven. And then there is ProofShot, which I actually think is a pretty fun tool mention. It is an open sourced CLI that tries to give AI coding agents eyes by recording browser sessions, capturing screenshots, collecting console and server errors, and bundling proof artifacts for humans to review or attach to pull requests. If agents are going to claim they built something, they should probably bring receipts. I think the cleanest closer for this one is this. The interface layer is becoming the story, not just the database, not just the bucket, not just the cluster, and not just the scanner. The layer in front of it, the workflow around it, the migration path off of it, the trust assumptions baked into it. This is where a lot of the real action is now. S3 is still S3, but the file system interface changes who can use it and how. Until the second incident shows it can turn into a broader distribution path for secret theft if the first breach was not fully closed. Ingress is still just Ingress until the controller everybody built around it starts aging out and you realize how much invisible behavior you were carrying the whole time. And Kubernetes is still just Kubernetes, but even it is starting to say out loud that newer workloads may need different shapes, different assumptions, and different guardrails. That's the human side of this stuff. A lot of ops pain comes from realizing too late that the helper layer was never really a helper layer. It was part of the system, maybe the important part. And the teams that do well are usually the ones that figure that out before the incident does. All right, that's it for this week of Ship It Weekly. Quick recap. Amazon S3 files, and why I think it is more managed file layer over S3 than S3 is EFS now, especially compared with the old S3FS and Fuse style approach. Malicious Strapi flavored NPM packages, the Trivy follow on incident, and why it was worth revisiting. Kubernetes Ingress2Gateway and the bigger Gateway API migration pressure, and Agent Sandbox as a look at where the platform may be headed next. Links and show notes are on shipitweekly.fm. You can also find the video versions on YouTube. And if you want more signal before the episode, check out oncallbrief.com. If this episode was useful, Follow or subscribe wherever you listen, and send it to the person on your team who keeps having to explain that the thing everybody calls just glue is usually sitting directly on the blast radius. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.